the September 5th, 2017 Duvall City Council Committee of the Whole order. First up is good of the order. Next on the agenda will be a presentation from Transpo Group on our transportation modeling, and then an update from Planning Director Laura Thomas on our sensitive areas ordinance. Does anyone have anything for the good of the order? Councilmember Walker.
Question for our mayor. You heard from Wade and scheduling some time.
Yes, I did. Gary got back to me today and I haven't followed up with him. He wanted to actually not so much the council, but yes, I will be meeting with Gary.
It's a free meeting and then possibly coming here.
Yes,
I think
that's
he's-
what I'm going to ask.
I think he's scheduled for the 19th, aren't they?
Well, I don't know that. I didn't schedule that.
I think they're scheduled for the 19th cow, the next cow.
Great.
Pretty sure, but wants to meet with the mayor before that, I think.
Yes.
And then briefly, just one request. During the last budget process, we were provided with a spreadsheet with a breakdown of departmental, basically staff to hours in comparison to general fund expenditure. It's like an overall spreadsheet that the city uses to do their departmental planning for the upcoming budget talks we're going to have. I think it would be helpful if we're provided a similar spreadsheet. It doesn't need to be formatted any differently from the last one. It could be technical and be a working document. But I thought that last one was quite informative, and it'd be great to have a similar spreadsheet so we can see how staff hours allocate the general fund expense.
Okay, all right. I will circle back with Lindsay on that one. Because what we were planning on giving everybody was 29. This is this year's budget, but this is what everybody was getting.
Right, the book is good. We'll go over departmental information presentations, but what we also had the request today was the spreadsheet that has basically the hours to staff break. That's a big picture of what he's been saying.
Well, I don't remember that specifically, but I'll put you back.
Great, thank you.
Great, anything else for good of the order? All right, let's go ahead and move on to the modeling 101. Wait, take it away.
Yes, ma'am. Good evening, Mayor and Council. We're going to have a short presentation today to discuss the transportation model. We had some questions from council as well as citizens about how this model was developed and how it's utilized. Myself, Larissa Grandell from Public Works, and Patrick Lynch from Transpo. Transfer is our consultant that assisted with the transportation plan. Patrick, would you be willing to just say a few words about your experience?
Sure. I'm Patrick Lynch. I'm a principal at Transpo. I lead our public planning group. So what we do is we prepare transportation plans for cities like Duvall. All of these plans require modeling, so we're very experienced at developing and running these types of models. So we were happy to help out and kind of provide this presentation, help explain some of the ins and outs of the model.
Thanks for coming. Yeah, that's very good. So what we plan to do is go through this presentation. Depending on Mayor Pro Tem and Mayor want this run, we can take questions from council during that time and make it relatively informal. We plan to send this presentation out after the tonight. So if there's any tweaks or anything that needs to be improved, we can do so before it's published to council. Okay, with that said, why are we here? We just wanted to include this slide in one more time to help reinforce the entire planning process. The city went through a 2015 city comprehensive plan. That was the goals and policies, the zoning, the growth forecasts. The transportation plan is an annexation of that plan. It looks at the items within the 2015 comp plan in a more detailed way. So during the comp plan, the EIS, we provided trip generation rates and other information for state EIS alternatives. And this is the way to circle the wagon to have a complete plan to document the preferred choice. So from that comes a transportation plan, which we will be discussing the modeling of today. And then from that is the annual 6-year transportation improvement program project list. We tried to keep as many abbreviations out as possible, but the slides were getting messy. Codes and standards and individual projects. And this is the real big one. This is a 20-year planning document. Therefore, it is very exhaustive, but it also is looking at estimates of future growth. When individual projects come in, we look at project-specific impacts and make sure that we can mitigate those impacts at that time. So our discussion, what's a travel demand model? We'll be touching on trip generation rates, our forecasting model that's developed from the transportation model, how we can use the model, and then looking at level of service and transportation improvements. There's been some questions about some intersections within the city. And then an example. So working with Transpo under the mayor's authority, we've done some pre-designed work for main roundabouts on 150th. And we'll present some images from that. So what is it? It's a tool to forecast what is going to happen when demand is expected. It's based on existing inputs and future inputs. And the main basis is the PM peak hour input. We'll be talking more about that, but Patrick, do you want to look that up later? Or?
Yeah, and just this is very typical of traffic models to focus on the PM peak hour, which is also the what the city's level of service standard is based on, and that we have some charts in the back, the presentation of why we focus on that bit. So but just to know that the traffic counts that we use to calibrate the model to the land use, trip rates, all that stuff is all focused on that 1 hour between 4 and 6, the afternoon commute peak hour.
And the reason the city's been using this level of service since, I think, 2004, but before, is because this gives us a good understanding about congestion within the city. Congestion isn't necessarily the volume of vehicles, it's the volume at the peak hour. So just adding vehicles, if they're distributed out for the day, may be different than if you add them at the PM peak hour, where you start seeing congestion at intersections. And these are the ones that cause people grief, and these are the ones that our local service standard are set by, and it's a time delay. So we'll get into that a bit more. And I guess we just go next.
I think there was a question.
Did we pick the option of asking questions as we go along, or are we wait until the end?
You're welcome to ask questions as we go along unless Boyd would prefer to answer.
We're fine, what I just asked is if we're going to address it a little later, if it's a question we're going to address with more detail, I'd love to have that option. But go ahead and give your question.
I was just wondering, that 1 hour throughout, that's 24 hours out, and it's also on the home side of the day. Have we ever looked at any other times of the day as samples? Have we, it seems difficult to think that one, when people are trying to get back into town, is indicative of the whole day, instead of when people are trying to leave, or when school lets out, or, different times of day you have peak circulation times.
That's a very good question. I'll take a stab at it, and we'll have Transco. Our level of service is based on the PM peak hour. So that's how we evaluate level of service as a city. That's how council in the past has adopted it. We also look at the AM peak hour. And so if it's for planning purposes, we're sticking with the PM peak hour because that's our process for level of service. When a project comes in, we also look at AM peak hour because we have the choice.
Looking at whatever we want
Yeah,
to, not just AM, but we can be specific about when we want counts. Because it's literally just having someone go out and sit at an intersection during a specific period of time and counting 2 counts.
And that's one, I'm going to have to chime in a second, but that's one nice thing about having our own model, which is Duvall specific. This isn't for anyone else, it's Duvall specific. It's calibrated during traffic counts. If we had an issue with Cedar Crest High School getting out at noon, that's something that the model could address.
Well, the model design, it's a weekday PM peak hour model. So it's really, and the reason that typically is chosen as the analysis time period is because that's typically the peak time period when most land uses are active. That's when you have retail and commercial uses that are generating trips. Schools, all of those things are typically converging and generating traffic at that time of the day. The AM, in some corridors, you do have more traffic in some places where it's, whether if it's kind of a peak commuter corridor or if there's a school there, a lot of times you'll see more congestion in the AM, but typically citywide, and remember this is a citywide model that we had to land on a single kind of analysis period, and that the weekday PM peak hour is just the one that's typically the highest 1 hour. It's the constraint, that we're working around.
But especially 4 to 5. I mean, if people leave work at 5 o'clock, they don't get out here until after 5.
So we'll address that in a few minutes
Yeah.
on another slide because it's the highest hour of traffic between 4 and 6. So at one intersection could be between 4 and 5, the next intersection could be between 4 4:30 and 5:30. Next intersection between 5 and 6. And I like the fact you brought this question up, because if we were renting, had a shift change in a plant at 8:10 in the morning, we'd be looking at the AM peak much more closely. For
And
Duvall, it's.
Yeah, and I guess here's the distinction too, and I think Boyd will talk about it, but the plan too, so you remember the plan's sort of focused on this, on PM peaked out, weekday PM peak hour. But when a development comes in and we require a traffic study through SEPA, we can ask for more analysis periods, and we often do sometimes. Like we'll often ask for an AM time period that specific development needs to assess not only the PM peak hour impacts, but also their AM, if it's something that is going to generate more traffic during the AM or other times during the day. So this, as a planning tool, is what we're focused on, the weekday PM peak hour, but it's not the only bite at the apple in terms of assessing impacts from development.
The majority of development is residential, and it's typically the PM peak hour. If it was a commercial development coming in, we I think we always ask for AM peak as well. And quite often on the bigger residential developments, we have the AM peak as well, and we need to pick and choose. And part of that is we want to make sure that if there's an impact, we mitigate it. And the PM peak hour is also used to calculate fees. So if a restaurant had its rush between 7 and 9, we'd be looking at that to make sure that they pay their fair share of improvements. If they're closed between 4 and 6 at night, then we really do. So that's, and we'll hit on this again in a few slides. So it's understanding existing and future traffic patterns. And once again, the future is basically the present and impacts from specific development. So when we talk more about the model, you'll see that we use these when a developer comes in. Transport will check their work. We send this out. I'm a PE, but I'm not a transportation specialist. We have them check it, and quite often it's running a model. And then this is what's really cool about this model. Once we understand that this is developed in the city of Duvall, it's specific. King County has an estimate of our trip generation rate. PSRC has an estimate of our trip generation rate. They're not Duvall specific. They're not calibrated based on our traffic counts. And they don't understand all of our specific growth information. We have a much, much better understanding of that. And the last one, well, I guess it gets to policy. We want to make sure that the policies that council proposes and adopts reflect what's happening in the city. We all understand that what's happening out of the city impacts us, but this is what we control right now. Okay, so this is the model. We developed a Duvall-specific model, and we have a slide for that. And it's based on what we have for growth, or for existing development. We know every single piece of property. In 2015, we looked at every parcel, understood use and the trip generation rate. We then calibrated that with traffic counts. That's the good part about this, because just throwing in trip generation rates is not enough. You have to calibrate the model with the traffic counts. And then once we understand that for the current, we can go to the future. And that, once again, is based on the 2015 comp plan assumptions for anticipated growth.
So, I mean, just to kind of reiterate, so I mean, basically there's two pieces that we're calibrating. Boyd conducted an inventory of all the existing build development, basically what's the inventory of not only residential dwelling units, but also employment areas, so number of employees per job site and those sorts of things. What we're essentially trying to do is take that and calibrate it to actual counts that we collect. And then all of the model assumptions, those are kind of the noms that we're using to calibrate. So really trying to understand how this land use generates this amount of traffic and match it to existing traffic. So that's, in short, what calibration means.
And this is the big one. We have to understand, demonstrate the existing model as a valid representation of our traffic before we can use it for future growth. And that's the transportation demand methodology that goes into the plan that's reviewed.
Yeah, I mean, and we talked about this a little bit before we came in. It's just that what really the whole calibration process is so we don't really use the calibrated model really as, we have counts that are real data. The calibrated model is a way of creating a tool for forecasting so that the better the calibration, the more confidence that we have that if these same conditions happen in the future, that we have some confidence that the model will replicate those travel patterns. So that's exactly what we're trying to do with calibration.
And we'll be talking a little later about the generation rates themselves. Roy was in 1.0 for single-family residential instead of the range, which may be 0.5 to 2.7, and we'll get to that in a moment. Primary inputs, supply. So that's the network, and the demand is the land use. Like I said, we have a very robust understanding of our land use. Other typical inputs, parameters, I'm going to ask Patrick to just briefly touch those. The big one is the commercial. That's the one that usually causes the
Yeah,
most
and so you have the number of units, and we categorize them either by residential household or employment by different types of job sites, you know, whether it be commercial, manufacturing, office, whatever it might be, retail. And then we associate a trip generation rate to that type of land use. And so the model is kind of developed, you know, with all these different land uses and trip rates. And then there's different trip types. So what we differentiate between a work to home trip or a home to the shopping center or whatever it might be. So there's, and without getting into the weeds too much, so there's a lot of kind of different slices of trip making. It's not just, the model is able to kind of make decisions based on, you know, different land uses and the different trip types that come out of those different land uses, so.
Yeah, as part of the commercial, like I said, usually you mentioned that's the one that people usually have concerns about is the generation rate of commercial because it varies widely by use and employment. The city went to the extreme as to get the employment data from the state, and it's proprietary knowledge, we should check it anyway, to understand how many employees there were for each business, and then use that to help generate.
It's tough. The covered employment's always the toughest to really get solid numbers on. And there's a lot of confidentiality surrounding employees, the actual specific number of employees, especially in a small city where you know, we're not talking really large numbers of employees. So we need to get as good a data as we can get. And a lot of times it can only come from folks that are actually here in the city and have a good understanding of where the employees are, what job sites they're at.
And it's like 7 or 8 different categories, and we're pretty happy with the detail we
Yeah.
have on this. We've talked about these. The main one here is calibrating to create a city-specific model. So we've asked about counts. Now, we had limited budget for the 2015 update, and I think we did a total of 5 new counts. But what we did is we also looked at 2014, 2013, and 2012. And of course, the most recent counts were the ones, do you want to?
Well, I just say, yeah, I mean, what we try to do is not, you know, we want to be, you know, good stewards with the city's money. So when we're identifying areas to count, if there hasn't been a lot of change in certain areas, even older counts can still be relevant. And so that's kind of what we did. There's kind of a patchwork of kind of counts from different time periods, but and Boyd actually has some kind of charts towards the end that show that there hasn't been in a lot of places like real significant year-over-year growth in counts in some places. So we basically spot checked a couple places with new counts and to kind of help fill in the gaps.
And a few of the intersections that we had concerns about were 152 75th and Woodville Duvall and Maine. And then also there's a lot of work going on 3rd with the future Duvall Urban Village work. So we had one up at 3rd and 145th, and then 275th and Big Rock Road. Big Rock Road's always it's a big generator because there's out of town trips. So we updated that.
I think the other thing too to point out, the city conducted an origin destination study, and this was like probably 2009, 2010. It's been a few years, but basically that's a good piece of information. So not only are we interested in understanding trips that are generated within the city, we're also interested in regional growth and the travel patterns of those regional travels. So the model is sensitive to that. And this model in particular was informed by that origin destination study.
That was actually a pretty big effort. I think it was 2009.
It's significant, yeah. I mean, it's a little more, it's a unique kind of data collection because you're really tracking at a citywide level where traffic comes into the city and where does it exit.
That's license plate specific, so
Yeah.
they're actually checking.
Yeah, you're basically checking every vehicle, yeah.
So I'll take the first two, and we're kind of saying the same things over again, but I really want to reinforce how this was developed. So we had the calibrated 2015 model, and you'll show some percentage, how close it
Sure,
came to the
okay.
actual stuff. And we took the adopted, the preferred EIS approach, and pushed that through the model. So even before we had done this work, we had already pushed those through, so people understood what each of the EIS alternatives had for potential repercussions. But once we had the adopted one, we were actually really going to look at it in more detail. And then the future demand stress test, that's
Yeah, so basically it's to understand when we apply demand on the model, how does it react, and to see if it does things that we think are reasonable, it's like with any model, like if it was a hydraulic model or whatever it might be, it is, once there's stress that's applied to the network, does it react in a way that we would anticipate it to react? And so it's just a way of checking, sort of a reasonableness check to make sure there isn't something strange that the model's doing under that it behaves differently when it's not stressed than when there's more stress placed on the network. So it's sort of a kind of a set of kind of rigorous exercises that we go through to make sure that the model is doing the things that we want it to do, or we think it should do, given how traffic reacts and what we know about traffic engineering and all that stuff.
Yeah, I'm talking too much, but this is very interesting to me. So it's not just looking at the existing network. In the future model, it includes Third Avenue being constructed and the rest. So
Yeah.
if we came back and saw zero traffic on Third Avenue from
Yeah.
Big Rock Road North, we'd understand there's something wrong.
Yeah,
Or if
and
it's
that's-
super huge.
What you get a lot of times where like something, what you might see in some cases where it's not doing the things that you would anticipate is that it's springing traffic into a place where we know that there's something that's not working correctly because traffic wouldn't want to go way out of the way to avoid.
Like taking Broadway instead of Main Street.
Yeah, so that's kind of what that is sort of like another, so, because really what we're, like I mentioned earlier, this is a forecasting tool. This is really what the model's developed for, is to kind of forecast future travel conditions. And so that's what we want to make sure it's doing correctly.
And the last one is Larissa's, and it helps develop the CIP-TIP, which is the Capital Improvement Program and the Transportation Improvement Program. And Larissa worked a lot on that, with the costing and the rest, but it's basically, what do we have to do to accommodate this? So we need.
That's pretty much it. Based on what the model spits out as far as the forecasting, then we can identify where we can start looking and putting projects to mitigate those demands. And to look, and that's partially what we're doing with 150th right now, is because we're looking at our programs for the traffic calming and for the traffic circles, and looking at not just the traffic circles, but ways that we can slow traffic down and control it along that corridor, because we know that eventually it's going to have a higher demand.
Yeah.
So it's just identifying things that we can try and get ahead of by using these forecasts.
And we've gone a little further than that on this plan as opposed to 2011 adopted plan, or 2010, whatever the final adoption date was, because it includes ADA, it
Yes.
includes safe routes to school,
Yeah, those are ones that we added, and the traffic calming too.
and some of those may not be full eligible for developer impact fee costs, but they're eligible for some. Or if they're not, at least they're on the program, so we can look for grants. Patrick, would you?
Yeah, so just like, and kind of we hit on this earlier about the calibration process. So again, we're, given the land use assumptions, or I get not even assumptions, but the land use inventory that we collected, the exercise is to calibrate that to actual counts that we collected. And there's a number of model assumptions or kind of knobs that we can turn in terms of that calibration. One of them is trip generation, it's kind of at the rate at which land use generates traffic. Typically, we start out with what we call the Institute of Transportation Engineers trip rates, and these are published in they have a trip generation manual, and so they do, a number of studies with these different types of land uses, and they develop these average trip rates. And so we typically start there, but it's not, because every community is a little different, that's not where we end. And usually we will make adjustments to the trip rate if the counts indicate that we need to, if there was a reason to get it to calibrate. And when we say calibration, usually for traffic models, if you're within 15% of actual counts on any given corridor, that is considered within reasonable tolerances for calibration. And so that's in the case of Duvall, that's kind of how this went, where we went through this exercise, and the IT trip rates that have been reliable in most communities that we've worked in were reliable here as well. So I mean, I'll leave it at that, and I know that might leave some questions unanswered in terms of ITE and, how does, 1.0. Remember, this is a PM peak hour trip rate, so it's not a daily trip rate or whatever. It's really focused on that 1 hour of the commute afternoon peak period.
And we've had questions, why doesn't the city develop their own trip rate? And there are a couple of answers. One, that's not what is generally accepted. You use the,
I would say the only thing that's still possible to do, the city would have to replicate those studies that ITE has done. So, I mean, it would require a number of unique traffic studies just for Duvall. And that's why this trip generation manual is used, because that work has been done. And it's not necessarily perfect for every community, but it's very close.
It's conservative too. Conservative, it's built into the model to be conservative.
Yeah, and that's something we talked about a little bit too, is that the model as a forecasting tool is pretty conservative. I mean, there's kind of a level of conservatism at every phase of the model. The trip rates is one of them, and so again, they're not necessarily intended to be perfect, but they are, I think, very representative of the types of land uses that are in there. And then in the case that it's not, in fact, this will happen, so kind of getting away from the model a little bit, like when we're reviewing traffic studies and there's, let's say, a development comes in, it doesn't happen so much with residential. Residential is it's been studied more than the other land uses in the trip generation manual. Usually where we get questions is on a certain retail or commercial uses, because especially with the way that commercial uses are kind of transitioning, like, some of these studies are, 15, 20 years old. And like there's been a lot of, the way that some of these businesses generate trips. I mean, you can look at, banks as one of those things. Like if we did a trip generation study on banks 20 years ago, like they certainly don't generate trips the same way that they did 20 years ago. So there's certain places where we will require the developer to provide their own independent trip rates verified by traffic studies that they've conducted, and that should be part of their traffic report to the city. It's like, if you're gonna use a different trip rate that's not in the ITE, then you need to show us that it's something that we can validate against best practices of developing that trip rate. So it's not to say that we don't use different trip rates. We will when it's warranted.
yeah. And part of the fine tuning, if you're, let's say, to put in a trip rate of 10 for single family residential for the PM peak hour, we would
not be within 15%.
Yeah, and this is kind of where this shows up, is like, we would have a very difficult time calibrating the model. In certain cases, you just wouldn't be able to do it, depending on how off that was. So that's...
Make it pointless to use as a forecast model, because it's not accurate. It's not, you can't get it to do what existing conditions are doing, so then you can't use it to forecast what's going to happen in 20 years.
And this is the one thing I will say, and remember I think the one thing, these models are forecasting 20 years out. And so the way I kind of help get people thinking about how to kind of use the model, how to think about it, is that it's a snapshot based on conditions and how people travel, what we know about that right now. 20 years from now, I mean, so it's not a crystal ball. It's basically a way of estimating that if things kind of stay the same in terms of what we know how people travel, how land use generates traffic, all of those sorts of things, that this is kind of a likely outcome of that. But we know that the way people will travel and, how the trip-making characteristics are going to change. There's a lot of things that are changing. One of the things that's changing is what we kind of the work from home or work from remote kind of alternative job sites, basically, where people telecommuting, teleworking, where people have been used to working and traveling to a job site where other folks are, will now, work in different places, and probably move further out to do so. Autonomous vehicles is gonna change the way people travel. There's a bunch of different things that we, as traffic engineers we don't have a real clear picture on exactly how these things are gonna transform our transportation system. And so that's why we're forecasting at 20 years, but it's not to say we won't revisit these forecasts as we get more information about how things are changing, and make sure that our models are taking in that information, and kind of that we're not kind of stuck with kind of old theories and methodologies, that we're being progressive with how we're thinking about the future system. So that's to say, it's like projects that we identify now on a 20-year list may not, depending on kind of the nature of that project, there will be different needs maybe than what we anticipated now.
Which is why we do the updates every
Yeah.
6, 7, 8 years, and we continually look at the model. We don't just say, okay, this is it, and then
Yeah.
we don't fact check with it, and we don't also, when new development comes in, and they say, oh, we're gonna generate this many trips, we can go to our model and say, does this make sense? Is this the way that we anticipated, this type of generation to be happening? So it's a good tool to use, but it's not something that we know is just gonna stay the same.
The GMA requires like a certain periodic update cycle, that, Laura is when she's updating the comp plan, but it's not to say that if things are changing, so like, we'll get into this, and it's not really covered in the PowerPoint, but like, we get the question of how often should we update the model? And, the best answer is, well, it depends on how much change is occurring in terms of either land use or traffic growth. Sometimes it can be growth outside the city. It's not even growth that's occurring within the city, but it's regional growth that's affecting roadways that are traveling through the city. And so we suggest that if things are changing more rapidly, that you probably should do more counts and update the model, and you can kind of assess your traffic out, within the periodic update of the GMA. Like this can you can have more frequent updates of your transportation plan that, you don't have to wait 8 years, I guess is the best way to put it. Yeah.
So we're about 2/3 of the way through the presentation. Can we speed it up a little bit? We really want to make sure people understand what we're, okay? All right, we'll go a little faster. I'm just gonna go this real quick. So once again, we looked at every single parcel. So the model looked at North Hill, Howard Hill, the potential for the North UGA coming in, because that's envisioned in the 20-year plan. One of the council members brought up, when we look at growth, how are we showing it? If we have a change from 2373 to 3213, the previous version of this table showed the actual amount of this relative to that as opposed to the growth percent. So it's 35%. We're looking at 35% growth in single-family residential within the next 20 years. So we try to simplify that a bit. They're still the same numbers, just a different way of looking at relating something to something or relating the change to something. So I just wanted to make sure you folks understood that that's there, and that's something that'll be revised as part of the, this is how we presented it last comp plan. It's quite often presented like that, but it was misleading if someone sees 35% as opposed to 135. The answer is the change is 35%. So real quick, the assumptions, we talked about these during the comp plan process. We don't say that everything's going to redevelop to the maximum possible use of that parcel. Otherwise, you'd be tearing this building down, tearing a bunch of homes in Taylor's Ridge down. What we did is we looked at the assumptions in the previous model, and they actually held true pretty well. Where we looked at, if it's a pipeline, we think there's a 90% chance those homes will come in. It's very difficult to say 100% chance on any of these things. Once again, these are for the 20-year plan, not for site-specific evaluations with developer annexation. Vacant land's the same. Redevelopable land, 45%. We think that's very low, because if you have a nice home on a lot that you tear the home down and replace it with 2 homes, it has a lot of cost. So once again, these assumptions were discussed and approved as part of the 2015 plan, but I wanted to show this because we've had questions about the North UGA model trips. The model used 139 trips. Well, the question we've had is, well, why don't you show the total amount? And the answer is, I'm going to try to say this as nice as I can. This is a model. We don't know if the area will ever be annexed. If it's annexed, they will use the total amount of trips when they look at their site-specific impacts. If we were to look at maximum growth for each of these things, we're going to find out we've got some serious problems. And I don't think people are envisioning Duvall with a 4-lane 203 that terminates at 2 lanes outside the city, or a 4-lane Big Rock Road that terminates outside the city at 2 lanes. So we look at anticipated growth. This is what was part of the 2015 comp plan. This is what was approved by PSRC. When this comes in, they will use the total growth. They won't use 165 proportionally shown. They'll be using the maximum development that could occur with that annexation. Remember, the background model shows that there are trips coming from North Hill, from Howard Hill and the rest. They'll be looking at the actual numbers for when those are completely developed out. At the time that the model was created in 2015, those were glimmers of thought. They hadn't final platted. So I just want to really reiterate that this is a 20-year plan. And when projects come in, we look at very rigorously at the actual development plan and the maximum development.
Well, there's a specific proposal that we can kind of sharpen our pencils on. A lot of this stuff is, we're kind of have our planning hats on and we're looking out a long ways. And so there's always kind of that level of probability of how much if it does come. So you want to be conservative but reasonable, because the unreasonable forecasts aren't really helpful forecasting tools.
Any questions? Yes, sir.
So, okay, so they use a 100% model, but if they get annexed in and built, does that model only encompass their development and maybe one trunk line out, or does it encompass trips to the high school and Big Rock and 203 and all those other arterials coming in and out?
That's an excellent question. So if this annexation comes in to council, prior to 50%, as part of the 50%, they actually have to submit a transportation impacts analysis. What they'll do is they'll be using our model, they'll be updating it with current counts, current traffic counts, which is good. It's better than 2015, that's what the comp plan was. They'll also be saying, okay, now North Hill was at 90% because it didn't have final plat. North Cove could have never had a final plat, but we said 90%, now it's at 100, because those are legal lots. And the same with Howard Hill and the rest. So what they'll be doing is taking what we did as a 20-year planning tool, putting in real project impacts and units, and also looking at out trips coming from the rest of the city. And they use a similar pipeline project map that we do, it just is a little more rigorous than what you do for 20 years. Second.
And that applies citywide, I guess. It's the
Correct.
model.
Yeah.
Now that's a good question though, because we usually look at the intersections in the vicinity. So if we wouldn't be looking down at Roney and Batten for something in the North EG, just like